So I saw this debate between Princella and Candace Owens, and the topic of the debate was
no career will give women as much joy and fulfillment as raising children.
You say we live in a matriarchy.
Right.
Can you give me the definition of patriarchy?
Yes. Well, the patriarchy is the idea that the system, our system in America, is being run by men, and that women are having to exist under a system that immediately disadvantages them because men are behind it. And I disagree with that pointedly. I think actually we're living in a society where people are being very much influenced socially and politically by women.
Okay, so the denotative definition of patriarchy is father rule, and where positions of government are held majorly by men, where women are largely excluded. So 125 House of Representatives are female, and that's only about 25%.
Right.
And only about 28% make up Senate, and 3.3% of Congress up until this date have ever been women. So by denotative definition, we literally live in a patriarchy.
Yes. So I disagree with that. So I think what this gets to, which is actually an important part of the conversation, is that people always think that where there is disparity, there's somehow inequality, and I actually reject that entirely. I think it's just a difference in what we're interested in. I think we're biologically wired, we're interested in different careers, and just because if we looked in the fashion industry and said, oh, well, it's being dominated by women, it wouldn't mean that, okay, well, that means that the fashion industry is a matriarchy and men have no sense. It just means have no ability to communicate how they feel in the fashion industry. I literally think that those numbers show that we're just biologically different.
no, up to this point, right, Candace is claiming that we live in a matriarchy, right, which is a pretty loaded statement and perhaps intentionally controversial, but Princella immediately challenges that and asks her to define patriarchy. Now, this is a very important point in this conversation, because oftentimes people think that they're debating the same issues when they are not. So the fact that Princella asked Candace to define patriarchy was a very intelligent move, because if you're going to be opposing something, then it is important for you to define the original concept first. So the definition that Candace gave was more of a social definition. So she says that patriarchy means a system that is run by men that puts women at a disadvantage. Now, even though this is not the textbook definition of patriarchy, I have to agree with Candace here, because this is the functional definition of how the word is understood in society, especially when women refer to the patriarchy, right? So the literal definition of patriarchy, according to Cambridge Dictionary, is patriarchy is a society in which the oldest male is the leader of the family, or a society controlled by men in which they use their power to their own advantage. And this is the definition that Princella relied on when she mentioned the father rule. I believe that's what she said. And then she went on to support her point by pulling up some statistics from the government, where she was claiming that about 25% of women are in the House of Representatives, 28% in the Senate, and that historically about 3.3% of Congress has been women. And you know, this is correct according to information from the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University, and according to data coming out of the Pew Research Center. So from a strict numbers point of view, yes, we live in a political system, you know, that is dominated by men. But life is not black and white. There are many colors under the sun, and particularly, this is why I don't really like debates, because it forces people to do a sort of mental gymnastics just so that they can win an argument. And this is the sort of surface level kind of argument that there's no real learning that is taking place. And so we have to look at the issue of context, because context matters, right? So just because more men are sitting, in government, that does not automatically translate to that men are actually steering the direction of society. This reminds me of an accounting principle that we call substance over form. And what substance over form means is that a transaction should be recorded based on what it actually represents rather than what it appears to be on paper. So you can have more men in positions of power, right? If you're going to look at it that way, you can have more men in positions of power, but are those men representing the interest of men, or are they being steered by, or are they responding to social pressures, media narratives, lobbying blocs, and activist groups, many of which are dominated by women? So there is the hard power, and then there is also the soft power, right? So you have to look at those dynamics when you are going to make any kind of pronouncements on gender roles or gender disparity as far as power dynamics in society is concerned. So not because a political body is oversaturated with men does not mean that male interests are automatically being served. So at a point, Candace made an important point when she said that disparity does not mean inequality. In other words, just because there is an uneven distribution does not automatically mean that one group is oppressed. But is Candace right in saying that? So in order to determine whether or not what she's saying makes any sense, we perhaps have to look at what the data are suggesting. Well, this idea that men and women are biologically inclined towards different interests is actually backed up by science. And for that, I want to go to some research. So the first study was a US meta-analysis of vocational interest in 2009 called Men and Things, Women and People, a meta-analysis of sex differences in interests by Rong Su and James Rounds of the University of Illinois and Patrick Ian Armstrong from Iowa University. Now, this study analyzed data from over 500,000 people. The researchers found that on average, men scored higher on things-oriented interests like engineering, mechanics, and computer science, whereas women scored higher on people-oriented interests such as education, social work, or healthcare. Now, it was one of the most consistent patterns across age, ethnicity, and time. So basically, men prefers to work with things, they prefer using their hands, building stuff, etc., whereas women prefer to work with people. And this is biologically, naturally, men want to use their hands. They want to build stuff, right? And biologically, women prefer to work with people, teach, healthcare, social work, counseling, human resources, those sort of things. So the next study was on the gender equality paradox in STEM Education by Leeds Beckett University in 2008. And for those who don't know, STEM is science, technology, education, and mathematics, right? So this study looked at 67 countries and found that the more gender equal a country was, the less likely women were to choose STEM careers. You'd expect that, you know, the gap would shrink in places like Norway or Sweden, but it actually widened. Why is this? Because when men and women are free to choose, they don't all choose the same thing. And it is not because of oppression, it's simply because this is what they're biologically wired to do. This is their innate natural preference. A woman is not going to choose, a woman is less likely to choose going on an oil rig to work, or building a bridge, or going on a construction site to help build women are less likely to choose those jobs. So when Candace says that we're biologically wired for different things, there's actually, you know, scientific data there to back up what she's saying. So, you know, we have to understand that we can't just assume that just because there is a gap in representation in a particular area, like how Princella mentioned that, you know, there are more men in politics historically than women, it doesn't mean that you know, there is evidence of discrimination, or there is evidence of anything. You can't use that, you can't take that in isolation to support your claim, because it could very well mean that, well, women just are not choosing to go into politics. And of course, obviously, the flip side of that is there are barriers, but there are barriers to everything. You know, if you're trying to break into a space, if you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to go into a particular market, there are barriers to that. There are barriers to entry for everything. So, but the thing is, you can't just pick out one particular aspect of a thing and take it out of context and use it as, you know, a jumping off point to support your claim. Because we know that certain professions, women gravitate towards those professions, men don't. Certain professions, men gravitate towards them, women don't. So you can't look at a profession that is dominated by men and say, oh, well, see, there is evidence of patriarchy. It's like women just don't want to do those jobs because they are not naturally inclined to do those jobs. You can't use it as evidence of anything.